Hey, listeners, my guest today was Charlie Liang. He and I spoke in depth about account-based marketing, how companies can get ramped up, and all the things you need to consider if you're trying to apply account-based marketing to your sales process. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Kaizen Podcast.
Well, Charlie, I really
All right.
appreciate you being on the show. As a background, I know you've been at companies like Engagio and Lattice, and you've been involved in, as a thought leader in ABM for a long time. I'm definitely excited to learn from you, especially about ABM and how to operationalize it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Kyle. I think this has been a long time coming, and I'm excited to, chat a little bit more with you, especially with your knowledge as well about kind of the ABM and how to operationalize data.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I know Engagio back when you were there is definitely a leader in the space for ABM. So like as a primer, I feel like folks kind of know what ABM is, account-based marketing. Like those are kind of the three pillars of it. But like if you were moving companies and you're starting fresh in an organization, how would you decide whether ABM even fits or how you should start tackling that? Like where do you typically start when you're starting a company?
It's a good question. And I kind of recently experienced that, when joining Lattice.
Mm-hmm.
I won't go, deep into Lattice, but, essentially Lattice is, we sell HR software. We have about 10K, average contract value. So, each of our customers pay us 10K. We have about 1,300. As I was transitioning here, I was kind of going through the same process. And, initially, I think every company wants to go up market. So initially, my marching orders were, hey, let's roll out ABM here. And I kind of took a step back and I thought about kind of like what the company actually needed, not just in kind of 3 to 5 years to be a public company, but like what the company needs in the next 6 to 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, just looking at the metrics and looking at the product and looking at kind of the customer attributes from industry to kind of like what types of customers they were to kind of what types of people we sold to and which types of customers we had the least amount of churn in, it didn't really make sense for ABM. I think ABM only makes sense when your ACV is above a certain size. Obviously the higher the better, but I would say minimum for SaaS, that number is probably 25K to 40K. Mm-hmm. That's when you can, above that threshold, you can really start to do kind of good ABM is kind of what I've seen. Underneath that, you're still doing good marketing, but I think it's just classic demand gen at that point.
Yeah, when you said your guys' ACV was around 10K, I was like, in my mind, I felt, that feels like a little bit like it might be too transactional for a proper account-based marketing process. And so you're saying typically, like if you're north of 25, maybe even 50, that's where it's a slam dunk. But if you're below that, it's kind of iffy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And is that just an investment of time? Like it takes so much time for each individual opportunity.
I think so. I mean, it's kind of like, I was just in Vegas this past weekend, so I'll use kind of a roulette analogy, if you will.
There you go.
It's kind of like when you have a lot of accounts, there's 38 numbers if you count the double zero and the zero on the roulette table.
Yeah.
If you have a TAM like, in the SMB or the mid market, if you have a small ACV, then you have that many numbers on the roulette table, right? Yeah. And then to be able to win, you just spread your bets around and you don't put it all on one number. If you put all on one number, then then the bet could fail. But then if you have an enterprise, if you only sell to enterprise accounts, there's not that many numbers. There's not that many accounts you can sell to. So then if you only have 8 numbers that you can bet on, for example, then maybe you put more chips onto 8, like each one of these numbers. Is that kind of what you've seen as well?
Yeah, you go all in on double zero, right? Because there's just
you got it exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. The roulette's a good analogy, having played that myself. But yeah, I mean, I think that intuitively makes sense of like if you're selling a $500 one sale close, it's not worth the time to do all this research. But let's assume you're a company that's maybe at 10K, but you want to get your deals to 100K. Do you think it's worth starting to explore ABM? Because like companies may have a mix where they're not just only enterprise or only mid-market or only SMB. They're tending to spread the gamut. Or are you finding that like in those cases it's worth investing in ABM with the intent of growing big, or do you feel like you should try to grow big and then institutionalize ABM?
That's a great question. I always think you should be thinking about kind of like the future, the 2 to 3 year horizon, and starting to even get learnings for when the company is ready for ABM. When Lattice started last year, we were at 5K ACV. This year we're at 10K ACV. Next year we're going to be aiming at 25K ACV. So like the company's growing. Like not every company is like that, but I think when you have a company that's growing ACV that fast, that's going up market that fast, I think you have to accelerate the thinking of the future. And I think the way to do that is to start to experiment with campaigns in the larger enterprises and get your sales reps kind of at bats in that segment.
Yeah.
Because that's when they can, come back and have real world feedback on, if they win, great. But if they lose, then you learn. Those learnings are going to be really critical, especially as your company moves up market. So I always think it's a good time to kind of invest in ABM early. And the way you do that is you do, like maybe dedicate 25% of your time, in our current stage, and then you try to get some learnings there. And then once you're there, then you can have some learnings already in your back pocket, and then you can hit the ground running.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so I'm pretty naive when it comes to ABM. Like my idea of that is like, let's just use contacts and not use leads anymore. That's essentially as far as like my experience goes with that. Like, what do you see as like the core pillars of this is a successful ABM implementation, or this is like how I think about structuring it broadly? Let's assume you're 50 to 250K deals. What are the core pillars of how to build this process and operationalize it outside of just using contacts and not leads anymore? Or, that even applies.
Yeah. I think you're selling yourself short there, Kyle. But I'll. But I think the real challenge with ABM, and where a lot of companies kind of fall short, is that they kind of rush into campaigns. They kind of just like start running these. There's this one company I worked at. Did really well, but we kind of rushed into campaigns, and we basically. This is when the Apple Watch came out. We would mail these Apple Watch chargers to folks, and then say if they took a meeting, we would send them the Apple Watch. It was a good campaign, but it was obviously a very high value campaign, so we didn't have budget to kind of do it to everyone. But we got a lot of meetings, but a lot of times the meetings were not with the right people, and there was also a lot of accounts that we just couldn't get exposure to. The learning from that was always start with kind of the account list build out. I think that's super important. Start with kind of, especially when your TAM is just a few thousand accounts. When you're ABM, it's not that many accounts.
Yeah.
Sometimes even less than that. So you start with the accounts and like just understand who is at those accounts, the primary decision makers, who are the influencers, what does the org structure look like, what else are they using, what are they thinking about for in the next 6 to 12 months, like what are the pains. So you really do your research. The only way to do your research, I think, is to you go to your publicly available data sources, but you also want to kind of like mine your own data, because data is going to be a differentiator. If your competitors are targeting the same accounts and you're more well researched, then automatically that puts you in a better advantage, because now your talk track's more elevated and it's more tailored to the customer. So I think the data component is an often overlooked piece of ABM, and I think it's also the most important piece.
Yeah, because it's kind of it's the backbone of it. If you have crummy data or you don't have a good account list, even if you found the right people with the right message, if it's the wrong group of accounts because they're SMB, you're just not going to find success. Yeah.
Yeah. And exactly. I think, oftentimes if you don't have the right people at the account, you have to, you waste your time poking around and getting intros. And then, that could be time lost, especially when accounts are in an active deal cycle. A lot of times people don't respond to that. It's really important to get in front of the right people, and then the messaging will come.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say you and I let's just say you and me start a business tomorrow selling widgets to enterprise companies. So we know we want to do enterprise. Like, should they just be pulling a list of the Fortune 500 and saying, let's talk to them? Or do you feel like a company should really have some, like you're using at bats, to have conversations with some of those enterprise type companies to see where there's a fit, and then from there decide who their account list is? Or is it like, do you try to include as many accounts in your account list, or try to exclude as many accounts from your account list? I guess that's kind of the question behind the question.
That's a good question. Yeah. It depends. I think you want to like really do your, I think you want to start with the best of the best, but you also don't want to like make it too narrow, because there's, in the enterprise, if there's one thing I've learned, in the enterprise, every company is different. They all have unique challenges. That's why selling to the enterprise is so hard. So I think it's really just finding kind of a pocket of users, that have a challenge that you can solve, starting with that. And then once you solve that, I think expanding to other pockets of accounts. But I think that there's also a lot of merit to not starting. Like if you and I were starting a company tomorrow, I'd be really curious your thoughts on this as well. But like, I'm not sure I would necessarily start in the enterprise, because it's so hard, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to convince someone to, spend 7 figs with you. I would actually start lower and then seeing if there's a wider group of challenges. But I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I've never seen a company, or I should say it's super rare for me to see a company start out of the gates in enterprise, because like you need a lot of that social proof. I feel like if you're selling to General Electric, they're going to want to see that you got Facebook and Amazon and Google, because then, that social proof makes it easy for them to move forward. But if you are like, hey, G, you're going to be our very first customer, that feels like a heavy lift. unless you are like a persona in the industry that everybody, if you're Steve Jobs and you're going to start another company, G is going to have that conversation with you and they're going to trust you. So it's almost like if you've got this like CEO who's like, which is not me, super well known, that makes it easy for them to like buy into you because they can buy into your reputation rather than, hey, this Charlie and Kyle who we've never heard of are starting a company, they got a product. Even if it's a slam dunk, they're still going to have hesitations because there's not that social proof. So I think you're right.
Totally agree.
It makes sense to start kind of mid-marketish.
Yeah, and I think what you're kind of hitting on is risk aversion. I think like folks in the enterprise are, because they have more systems, they have more resources, they don't need to necessarily take the risk. So I think it's building up that reputation and honing your product and getting social proof that helps with the procurement process once you get there.
So if you're doing 6-figure deals, I'm guessing these are companies that are making at least 10 mil, 20 mil a year, at least, like at the very bottom, if not much more. So you're talking like meaty companies that are pretty big. How much of your ABM process do you think of like, for you guys, you're selling HR, but that could be HR specifically buying it or the COO or the CFO potentially buying it, depending. Like you're never quite sure probably till you have that conversation with folks.
Yeah.
So like, how do you think about how to tackle this? Are you like, we're going to try to talk to everybody, or do you try to say, we're going to go after the HR people for a while, then we're going to move on to these and then move over to the COO at the end of the road? Or do you try to do all at once?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a fantastic question. I think it depends on company size as well, but I'm a big fan of not doing too many personas because a lot of the times I've found that when you have too many personas you're trying to talk to, like you might be a small startup yourself, so the product marketing function might be nascent. I think that you tend to say the same thing to everyone. When you say the same thing to everyone, then it only applies to a very small fraction. So I would actually just suggest, I like to kind of start with a small group. For us, that's the HR, operations, people operations team within an HR department that is usually in charge of kind of like rolling out strategic initiatives in HR. A lot of times these initiatives actually start from the top, at the executive staff level, either because the company is growing really fast or the company is going through some change and needs a process to kind of manage that change. And then that gets kicked down to the people ops. It's a good way of finding inbound. So I think inbound, just harvesting the intent when the people ops team, comes in or just being proactive. They might be thinking about a project next year, but you're 3 months away. So going in with that messaging to a specific group, I think is really good. And then, on the outbound side, I think it's okay to also go to the executive staff because they might have longer field vision and see things that might be coming down the line, 6 to 9 months from now. And then once you can get ahead of that, then you might get that at bat because that executive might remember that you outbounded them with this messaging. And then once that timing is right, they'll send it down to their people ops team. So I think that's kind of the way we're looking at it. But like, we don't try to boil the ocean. I mean, we could also easily talk with, managers because we have a tool that helps managers have better one-on-ones with their team, give better performance reviews. But we tend to find that it's kind of one-off and they're not decision makers. And we lose a lot when the managers, like essentially the managers need to refer us to the people ops team. So it's usually easier to go directly to the people ops team, unless the manager manages a big team and then has a pain point, themselves. That's like priority number 1, priority 2. That works as well. But in general, I think not boiling the ocean. What have you found, Kyle?
I always find that there's this like argument between like sales or marketing or like even enterprise reps and or management and individual contributors where some people say like, we got to start at the top because that thesis makes sense of like, if I get the CEO to commit to a project, it's clear it's going to get done. If I get an individual HR associate to commit to a project, there's no guarantee that's getting done. Exactly. And so that's kind of the idea. But there's also value in like, if you find that 10 people who've used your guys' product started at Facebook tomorrow, you would probably want to hit those type of people up to work bottom up because they could, build some, brand awareness, brand association positively throughout the organization. Cause that's very impactful too. Cause, like obviously one person can impact a deal negatively if they've had a bad experience, but if you have a bunch of people who've had a positive one, it can go the other way. I'm of the belief that like, if you start at the top, they can get things done. But what I find is that a lot of the, like from my personal selling something tactical to a person who's strategic can be very hard because they want to think about a big, broader vision. But if you've got a tactical solution, it's like hard because they're going to kick you down anyway. So I'm not a super great salesperson to begin with. So I'd say I don't know. There's other people that know better. But I'm, from an account-based marketing perspective, I'm trying to think of like, if I were a new company, how should I be like, I agree that we start with accounts, because if you don't have accounts dialed in, you're going to go nowhere. Second, I think you're definitely right on of like, let's kind of limit our personas to where we have the best match. Then the third is like, who are those people and how are we going to message to them? Depending on how you're going to sell, bottom up can definitely work. I always like a top down one, because like getting that executive dialed in is super critical. You're going to need that no matter what to get a sale. So you might as well start there. But I think a lot of people would probably argue with me and say bottom up's the way to go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can definitely have success doing both, but it's different cycles, and it depends on how good your messaging is. You hit on one thing that I want to kind of like double click on. You said when people, move to a different company, that's a really good time to kind of try to push an initiative through. I've seen that, happen time and time again. I think that mainly it's because of two things. If I really kind of think about it, I think number one, I think when you're new to a company, I think you have some capital that you can kind of use. Yeah. Like you can have one or two suggestions that the company will, want to adopt, especially if you're higher up, you can have more. Mm-hmm. And I think that, depending on what those initiatives are, that can be a really powerful moment to kind of reach out. Mm-hmm. The other piece I think that's really important is everyone has a different appetite for risk reward tolerance. Mm-hmm. If you're a startup and you have a kind of a cutting edge product, then your main champions are going to be the people that are willing to take risks and willing to bet on kind of the smaller companies. And I think that if you have a good product and you make them happy, then when those people move to different companies, it's not like their personality is going to change. They're still going to be early adopters. So I think finding those early adopters and just kind of keeping track of them is a really powerful thing that you hit on that I think a lot of companies overlook.
Yeah, there's obviously a ton of sales triggers, right? Like a person changing jobs, they took on a round of funding, they acquired a company. Those are all triggers that people tend to bite on. I'm definitely biased towards the like tracking people changing. I think that's an interesting concept that I hadn't thought of, which is like, yeah, a person bought your product, great, that might buy it again. But a person who is like, it's almost like a persona, is a person who's a risk taker. They're willing to try something new that somebody won't, is like, that feels like heavy ABM. If this is a type of company who wants to be bleeding edge in a lot of ways, those are the ones you should lead into versus, hey, we're going to work with company X that, geez, been around for 175 years. They're not going to make any changes without, ripping teeth out. So it feels like those are the ones you want to avoid. But there are probably a bunch of, forward-thinking, even enterprise companies that want to make change because they realize how, like Amazon's probably a good example there. Like any of your FANG companies are going to be good to go. So I think being able to segment those folks out, and then, outside of, tracking champions moving, what do you find is like the triggers that you try to incorporate into ABM?
Yeah. A lot of the triggers you mentioned already, but I think the triggers that I've seen kind of work really well. Funding times for us, when a company grows and scales in a fast way, they need to keep their employees happy. Actually, downsizing tends to be a good moment as well. We get a lot of people coming in when an employee kind of, leaves unexpectedly. They're like, oh, I didn't realize that, so-and-so was so unhappy. So I think, that's a negative thing, but it also tends for us to be a good kind of trigger event. I mentioned, I think, if people are going to shows, if there's a key hire made, personnel changes are always really important. Whether whether a company has plans to grow, this is even like before the funding amount. A lot of times, forward-thinking companies, when they plan to grow, they're going to invest in the infrastructure early, and we get, a lot of that there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably missing a few triggers. Are there any that I'm missing that you've seen kind of in your experience?
Yeah, round of funding is like a slam dunk. Oftentimes I've seen if they buy a competing or complementary product. So let's say you guys complement well with Stripe, let's just say, and you see a company add Stripe, that should be a situation to reach out and say, hey, I know you're using Stripe. You're definitely going to need some HR to tie into that. That's a bad example because Stripe is obviously not tied to HR, but something along those lines. Or I know you just did a massive layoff or something along those lines. Some sort of news that impacts the business can be a good one. It was like the balance between tools, using APIs and tools to automate things versus people doing stuff manually. So, there are definitely tools like Crunchbase, the API. You can get any funding round, get that right into Salesforce, notify the rep, no challenges there. But there are situations like a trade show where we get a list and we got to share it and, tie it to an account and make sure the rep does, like they may have to go search Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. Those things are heavy on like manual efforts where things like in funding rounds or job changes may be automated. Where do you see like the ideal balance between what should be kind of automated and what should reps be doing? Because some people have this idea of like reps should never do things manually. We want to automate everything. And some say it's worth them doing everything everything manually. That's kind of the ABM kind of concept-ish. But I want to get your thought on
Right.
like, where's that balance?
Oof. I'm actually, yeah, that's a great question. I think, I mean, reps are expensive and they're
Yeah.
you can't, like, there's a limited quantity of them and they're really smart, individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that their time is best spent on creating messaging from the data and the research. I think research is important, but the messaging, like, you have to have the rep doing that. I don't think anyone else can be doing that. So,
Yeah.
ideally all the data is there for them and they're just thinking about how to use that information to make a compelling statement to whoever they're trying to get in touch with.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times that's not the case though, as you alluded to. I think a lot of the times, especially in this day and age of people, you can get a list of accounts that are visiting you on GT Crowd, for example. You can get a list of
Yeah.
accounts that have been on your website for the last 3 months. The problem is like these are just accounts, obviously privacy laws, unless you have people cookied, they don't tell you who the person is. So then, at larger companies, that could be hundreds of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an interesting thing that I've seen a lot of reps kind of struggle with is like, just, I know that, Johnson & Johnson's on my site, but I have no idea who it is. I know it's someone from Indiana, but I have no idea. And then they have to kind of guess around. I think if there's a way to kind of automate that, or if you have different insights to kind of automate that, I think that could go a long way. And then the reps can focus on kind of the what they're good at, which is the messaging.
That feels like a trigger that comes up often is people say this company landed on my site, so therefore they're definitely in our ABM process, like whatever we're going to do. Do you feel that that's like a pretty reliable source? Do you think that that's something companies should use? Having seen the data in the past, oftentimes I'm looking at them like, these are companies like don't apply or they seem all over the place, or like, how can we know for sure that it's Johnson & Johnson? Obviously there's an IP address, but like, do you feel that those are very trustworthy, or are you kind of skeptical of them?
That's a good question. I haven't, honestly, I haven't done that much analysis into the trustworthiness of the IP address. There's definitely, I used to work at Engage, obviously, but we used to sublease the building from Collective Health. So whenever I go onto someone's site, it'd be like, "Hi, Collective Health." So there's definitely a portion of that, but there's also like, people come to your site for a bunch of different reasons. They could have seen an article of you in the news and like they're not your persona. There's like someone that happens to work there. They could have seen an ad if you use lookalike, targeting.
Yeah.
The lookalike targeting doesn't take into account what company they're working for. It's just people. So, those people could be on your site. They could be looking for a job. There's a bunch of different reasons. So a lot of times, those triggers can end up being a giant waste of time as well.
Yeah. So we're still in pretty like unpolished territory in terms of being able to identify a person on your site to a person that could buy from you. We're still a long way from saying this is a clear step from one to the other.
I think that's right. Right. And I'm not sure with the privacy laws that we'll ever get there.
Yeah. And I mean, that's probably good from privacy perspective. I love that like sites just don't know who I am. From a business perspective, it seems like there are definitely some vendors in the space or people that say, like, I worked on teams where the marketing team is like, this company came to our site. And I'm like, this is Verizon. This just is like, is an ISP, an internet service provider. It's not actually Verizon on our website. It's just some person who happened to use Verizon Internet. And so it felt like there was tension where someone had bought the tool without necessarily having buy-in from the sales side, and then there's not necessarily trust there. So there's friction on the marketing side because they're pissed that these MQLs aren't being pursued, and then sales doesn't trust them because, like, who knows if this is an actual IP address or you're just working at Collective Health.
100%.
Yeah. 100%. So let's say you've got accounts, you've got your kind of key triggers based up, you've got some sort of mix between automation and manual effort. You mentioned that you kind of think that the value that reps add is like really thinking strategically about how can I craft a message that's so personalized or, makes them want to talk. How do you balance that? Like, there's a lot of conversation going on, obviously, around like personalization at scale. Do you think that that's a realistic concept, or it's like kind of an oxymoronic thought of like really personalizing at scale?
I think it's definitely oxymoronic. I think it's definitely oxymoronic, although I've seen it actually done well. You have to be really clever on it. A lot of the times there's a fine line between clever and annoying.
Yeah.
But I think that the safest way to go, if you don't have that many accounts, why risk that? Because a lot of times, you only have one at bat. Mm-hmm. If you don't get their attention and you annoy them, then they're going to unsubscribe, and then then you lose the email channel.
Yeah.
So I think that, like, why risk it? I think I've seen it done creatively, but I think that a personalized approach is definitely the way to go. I think that you can, there's a bunch of different things. You can use the triggers that we talked about earlier. Flattery, people like to feel good. Flattery always goes a long way. You can use mutual connections. You can use other types of events to make them feel like, you're not saying this to anyone else. And I think once you do that, you have a much better chance of getting an interaction with them.
It always kind of like blows my mind how much I remember getting extremely frustrated about having SDRs that were doing some form of like account-based marketing, but every time I talked to it was like, what are you working on? Oh, I'm doing outreach, or I'm doing research. I'm doing research. I'm prepping. I'm researching. I'm like, it feels like there's so much time spent researching and so little actually doing outreach. But there's this like old Abraham Lincoln quote. I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's something like, if I had 5 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 4 of them sharpening my axe. And I think that totally applies. Like, there's a buddy of mine who worked at a company doing sales, and he's like, I get 7 leads a week. And that's all I get. So I have to get 2 of those every single week to meet my number. And thinking of if you've got to get 2 out of 7, that's a really hard thing to do. You got to spend a lot of time researching. Essentially 2 out of 7 is a quarter. So you're spending at least 10 hours just doing research on those people, if not more. So it's really a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think the best people definitely realize that, you have some folks that coming in and they'll make their numbers, but they'll scorch the earth, and then after the earth is scorched, you can't farm on it anymore. I think the best approach is definitely picking off small pieces and really trying to get into those pieces. We recently ran a direct mail campaign where we basically sent folks some candles and some nice spa items, and we said if folks took a meeting, then we would send them like their next spa day would be on us. And we send them in waves, and each rep would get 10 to 20 packages they could send to for each wave. So it wasn't like they had a lot. So they knew they had to kind of make it count. We had one rep that literally hand delivered the box, 2,000 person company. And he was trying to get in touch with the VP of HR. So he went all the way past, he went up to the front desk, and then he somehow got past security, and then literally found her desk, and then she was at her desk, and then he hand delivered it to her.
So
and he did that for a few.
Trespassing.
Well, he got that bad. He hit his number, but but yeah, I mean, that's an exaggerated form of doing it, obviously. But I really think your analogy with Abraham Lincoln rings home in today's age.
Yeah, I spoke with Braden at Sendoso about the concept. We did a podcast episode, one of the first ones, on just the idea of direct mail. And it feels like, when phones first came out, people spam the hell out of phones, and now people tend to not respond to phone calls as much as they used to. And then email came out, and now that's kind of gone. Then handwritten notes came up, and things are becoming kind of not played out, but they're people have moved on, or they've tuned them out because it's become noise. At some point, the direct mail route will become noise. I'm curious to hear what your other methods of outreach are. What do you have any ideas of what will be on the horizon of how are we going to stand out when people are tired of getting cupcakes, or maybe they'll just never get tired of cupcakes because I like them all the time too. But I'm trying to think of what's the next frontier of people are going to have to find a way to stand out, because handwritten notes will become kind of 2008. But yeah, I'm just interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a really good, I think about this from time to time, obviously, as a marketer. I think direct mail will always be a level above kind of phone and email, just because when the phone rings, at this point, we can all tell the spam, phone numbers from the not spam phone numbers. Emails, kind of the same way, but a direct mail package, you're not going to not open a package. Have you ever thrown away a package?
Not a FedEx one, under any circumstances.
Yeah, not a FedEx one. Yes, there you go. I think it'll always, at least you'll get an open there. Some other channels that I think are underutilized, but I personally would not kind of, if done the right way, I would respond, but it could also be, annoying, is text message. So if you get people, who uses office phones anymore, I think, a lot of people are just throwing it out the door and just kind of using their personal phones. I've been the same way in the last 3 companies. So there's definitely blurred lines between kind of your personal life and your work life, as much as we sometimes don't like that. But I think getting someone's I think texting is really interesting. I've seen a lot of successful reps kind of text when they're late in the cycle. It really helps kind of move the cycle ahead. Now, obviously, when used clumsily, that could be that could really backfire. So that's one kind of channel. The other channel I think that's really interesting is Slack. So Slack is, quickly becoming de facto medium of how companies communicate with each other.
Yeah.
They haven't opened up external, like you can invite a random guest to a Slack channel, but like a random person across the street could not Slack me today. I actually have a hypothesis that they might open that up one day, or have some way of kind of having outside people, being able to Slack you. Like that could be a good monetization channel for Slack. I don't know if they'll go that route, but if I were them, I would at least consider it. If and when that becomes the case, that could be a huge kind of, marketing channel. But I'm not sure if Slack will pursue that. So I could definitely see that being a huge channel in the future.
That's an interesting mental exercise, like like turning it into almost like in-mails, where I can Slack anybody I want in any organization. If they accept it, I don't pay anything. If they don't accept it, it's like $10, kind of like in-mails work.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I think if and when that happens, I think the early adopters, like you're going to see a 6 to maybe 2 year period where a lot of people aren't doing it yet, but the people that do it are going to hit huge bang for buck.
Yeah. It's like with anything, right? Facebook came out, everyone jumped on that bandwagon. Instagram, that's tapped out. People are going all kinds of different routes, but they're becoming played out a bit. And so Slack, that would be the first thing, is as soon as people get any traction, they're going to blow that up, because the cost of each transaction is relatively low, right? If you want to send a FedEx package, there's a lot that goes into that. But an email literally takes no effort. I just hit send, or I add someone to a list, and they get incorporated with the other 10,000 people receiving the email. It's like the no transaction cost to add another message out, but the impact to the person receiving it is like significantly more noise in their day. So they just tune things out even more.
Yeah. And I think that's why, like, even aside from Slack, you're seeing a lot of people turn to kind of like outdoor advertising. Outdoor advertising is something that you just cannot block.
Yeah.
As people like it or not, you can block digital ads, you can block emails, you can block phone numbers, you can block anything. But outdoor ads, you're kind of forced to look at it. Hopefully the ads are good and you like to look at it. But I think that's why a lot of people are kind of turning to outdoor advertising to get their message across as well.
I didn't realize that was having like a renaissance. Like I remember working company where we're not going to spend $100,000 to put a billboard on the 101, because like we're not going to get any ROI out of it, or we certainly can't track it. But every single week, people are putting up new billboards on the 101 for $100,000 a week, or however much it costs just to do that. So it's got to be effective to some point. Yeah, and then there's always a fear of like Minority Report, where billboards are dynamic based on me or something like that. But
totally.
One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, like, obviously GDPR is pretty prevalent in the EU right now. It's made a significant change in how businesses sell. Like if I want to sell to anyone in the EU, it's impossible, because it can't store data subjects information in my CRM, or at least outreach to them unless I have a specific business case. And I know Mark Benioff at Salesforce has really been kind of pushing for regulations similar in the US, which I don't know if this will take hold, because the US is a pretty different place than the EU. But I'm eager to hear your thoughts of if you think privacy considerations will really tamp down on companies' capacity to outreach in the future here in the US.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I'm not sure. I think the U.S. might wait to kind of, depending on how this stuff plays out in the EU and what comes out of GDPR, and like whether consumers are actually happy or whether it was an overreaction. I think that the U.S. might have some learnings from it. But as you mentioned, we're the only country in the world that uses yards and feet and a bunch of, inches and a bunch of other things that we kind of pride ourselves in having kind of a unique system. Yeah. So I think, given how big of a deal capitalism is here, like it's a big deal in Europe, but I think there's nowhere else than, capitalism is a huge deal. And I think a big part of capitalism is the ability to sales and market. That might be one of the tenets that we kind of hold dearly and say, this is just the way it is here. We're not going to, privacy is important, but our capitalism, it's kind of like privacy versus capitalism. Yeah. So I'm not sure how that will play out, but I think, both are really important. But, if I had to bet, I think the U.S. is going to hold on to its own tenets.
Yeah, fair. Do you guys do any sales in the EU, or how have you approached ABM in the EU, especially in the post or GDPR is now live world? Like, do you even touch it? Because a lot of companies are like, I'm not even going to think about it, just because there's so many unknowns right now.
We don't actively go into the EU, but we have a fair amount of customers in the UK. Sure. We do advertising in the UK, but we don't actively outbound into the UK. And I think because we have a really good product, there's a lot of word of mouth. If you all HR people are no more than 3 or 4 degrees connected, probably even less than that. to each other, and they all talk about the solutions they're using.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, advertising with a good product can actually go a long way in places where it's harder to kind of do outbound.
Yeah.
So that's been our strategy thus far. It's worked pretty well. I think roughly 15 to 20% of our revenue comes from that area, even though we're not actively outbounding.
Wow. It's definitely a testament to product and word of mouth. Because like, obviously, as you know, marketers change jobs every 12 to 18 months or so. So that's obviously opportunity for them to like share, like if they're a virus, they're spreading the virus to more people, the more that they change jobs. And that just happens further. And
they're good viruses.
Yeah. Good viruses.
And I think, that's why you've seen kind of the review sites like G2 Crowd, like Trustpilot, like Capterra, all these sites that, folks go to do research. I think they're already used to doing research on the consumer side, on TripAdvisor, on Yelp, where they're going to eat, where they're going to stay. I think, that's why it's important to have a good product and also have a good presence on those review sites, because a lot of times that might be the only way you're going to get in front of them.
Yeah, I personally, and I don't know if you feel the same way, I've been distrustful of those review sites because I know how much they're astroturf. Just talking to other people, they're like, yeah, I get so-and-so to mention X, or, on MSP, I brought this up to Pete on MSP, is like, hey man, I know this person is friends with the person who asked the question. Like, it's clear that this is being astroturf. I'm not saying you should kick this person out, but it's a problem across like everyone wants like an independent arbiter of like what's quality. And I think folks like Forrester try to put things out, but they're like too much in the enterprise. They're not very much in the mid-market of like your company, like, right. You're not going to stand out for that, but that's where tools like the MarTech 5000 list is kind of a tool like that, where it at least builds awareness, but there's no one that's giving independent audits of these tools to be like, here's the real one you should be using, without you paying $50,000 a year to get access to it. So it feels like, do you have anything like that for marketing? Like MSP is great for sales, but do you have something for marketing, a group that you lean on to be able to learn ABM or tools that stand out or things like that?
These days I've been fortunate to kind of, back in my Engager days, I was able to meet a lot of smart marketing people. So I feel pretty fortunate to have a pretty strong network. And just on my LinkedIn, like if I have a really tough question, I can just ask the network.
Yeah.
I think LinkedIn is for me, I think is a big source. There's also a few different Slack channels. Like Julian Shapiro, he wrote the Guide to Growth, found his own, agency Demand Curve. I think he used to start a Slack channel. There's a few thousand people in there now. So I think there's a bunch of these like Slack channels that pop up, and a lot of smart people in there. They're external Slack channels and there's no advertising in them. So that feels like a pretty safe kind of community. I would say probably mostly between LinkedIn and Slack. I wish I had, more time to kind of go to shows these days, but shows are obviously really good as well.
Yeah. Well, this is great, man. I mean, I personally learned a ton. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'd love to give you an opportunity to like explain how people can follow you and keep tabs with all the content you're putting out. Cause I know like you're definitely a thought leader in the space and put out a ton of like ebooks and things like that to help drive awareness for ABM. So how can people follow you and keep track of you?
Yeah, my LinkedIn is probably the best way. I post a lot. I don't post. I post probably once or twice a week. Just follow Charlie Liang, last name Liang, and then I occasionally post on Twitter as well. Charlie C Liang on Twitter, and I think those two channels. And if you follow me, I'll or message me, I'll connect with you. And then I think that's probably the best way. And thanks for having me on, Kyle. It's been really fun chatting about ABM and data and all that stuff.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for coming on, man.
All right. Cheers.
Cool.